Okay, looks like most people are here, so we'll kick off. Hi, and welcome to today's Ports webinar on the topic of getting the most from your Burp Suite Enterprise Edition subscription. Before we get going, some quick introductions. So I'm Adam. I'm part of our enterprise advocate team here at Portswigger. I work with our trialists and customers, supporting their evaluations, procurement of Enterprise Edition, and hopefully helping them getting the most out of the tool. To my right is Alex.
Hi folks, I'm Alex. I'm with the technical support team. So as well as the day-to-day support, we help customers on board with our products as well. I'll take us through the demo today and some tips and tricks around Burp Suite Enterprise.
We've also got James, Hannah, Kieran and Joe in the background today who are managing the Q&A facility in the Zoom toolbar. If you can make sure that you use this to ask any questions during the session, please use the Q&A facility over the chat box. Just helps us to manage that a little bit easier. We'll try and respond to them as quickly as we can during the session. If we don't manage to answer any of your questions, then don't worry, we can follow up via email after the session has finished. Also, you'll notice this session is being recorded and we hope to get that recording out to you after the session. So if you want to watch it back or if you want to share it with any of your colleagues, then please feel free to do so. Quick recap of the agenda. So as a recap, we'll be discussing maximizing scans, application and users. This is more of a reminder of our sort of unique licensing model here at Portswigger with Enterprise Edition. Alex is going to highlight the Kubernetes deployment, which has been made available earlier this year that some of you may have not seen. We're then going to run through sort of product overview, demo on best practice, manage your entire portfolio of sites and scans, how to trigger scans outside of the UI, a release update, which is going to cover some 2022.7 release with regards to the UI, so connection checks and progress updates that we'll showcase later. Some steps that we'd recommend that you take after the session. And then we've just got a short poll that we're going to run at the end of the session, if you don't mind, and we can cover off any other questions. So the first thing we want to cover, and it might sort of seem fairly obvious, we want to cover off sort of maximizing your subscription of Burp Suite Enterprise Edition. For a little bit of context, when we've spoken to customers previously, it's sometimes forgotten how our licensing model is different to other competitor solutions. So what often happens, Burp Suite Enterprise Edition is evaluated by maybe a small team, it's procured, and then it's rolled out to the wider team in your organization. And they may not have been involved with the initial evaluation. This can sometimes mean that the team that's actually using Burp Suite Enterprise Edition on a daily basis are not necessarily familiar with the capacity of the tool itself. So for the avoidance of doubt, it's worth remembering that Burp Suite Enterprise Edition is licensed on concurrent scans. We do not charge you for adding users. We do not charge you for adding all of your sites. We do not charge you for running an indefinite number of scans. So some of the previous feedback has been that teams are concerned that using the full potential of the tool, they have a fear of building up sort of a large bill at the end of the month. To reiterate, this is not the case, and we really do want you to be scanning all the time and adding all of your sites and adding all of your users. This is a massive differentiator between our product and other solutions that are out there in the market, and we really want to shout about it. Next up, I'm going to hand over to Alex, and we're going to look at the new Kubernetes deployment.
Thanks, Adam. So folks, if you've already deployed, it's likely you've chosen the standard installation process. Potentially some of you may have gone for our old CloudFormation deployment as well, which is now unsupported because we've released this new Kubernetes deployment. So if you have gone for the standard installer, you've got that up and running, you can stick with that. That's absolutely fine. That's kind of the mainstay of our deployments across the customer base. But if you've got any interest in containerization and looking towards Kubernetes, there's no problem in you moving across from the standard installer to Kubernetes. Just contact us at support and we can help facilitate that process. But in short, the new Kubernetes deployment method is effectively done via a Helm chart that we provide. And the idea is that there are no sort of restrictions as such around the infrastructure, which was one of the sort of main bits of feedback we had from the CloudFormation and ARM templates that we had previously. A bit more freedom in terms of what that underlying infrastructure looks like, and then you just deploy the application on top with the Helm chart. This also has the inherent advantage of the auto-scaling scanning machines. So whereas with the standard deployment, where you pre-provision your scanning machines, with Kubernetes, you don't. They are essentially created when you initiate a scan job. They'll run and then they'll die off once that scan finishes. The inherent benefit being in a cloud environment is around that cost element, because we're only effectively paying for what we use. The prerequisites around the Kubernetes deployment are as follows. So these are the only elements you need to meet for your own cluster. As long as you meet these, effectively, you should be able to deploy the Helm chart. So some sort of ingress solution, typically that's going to be a load balancer or an ingress controller. We'll need a persistent volume claim. So that's going to be application name that you give it -PVC, and that needs to be shared by all the nodes in the namespace. And then to enable the auto-scaling, the cluster auto-scaler must be installed enabled as well. But other than that, you should be able to run Burp Suite Enterprise on any x86-based cluster. So if you're AWS, Azure, GCP, or even private, you should be good to go. This is what that deployment looks like. So from a customer perspective, i.e. yourselves, you'd be responsible for the ingress, the web service, and the database. That database process still follows our normal external deployment. So we have all the docs and the scripts around that. It's just that that's effectively managed outside of the Helm chart. And then what the Helm covers is the web server pod, the enterprise service, and the enterprise server pod. Whilst the scanner pod isn't technically deployed by the Helm chart, that's looked after by the enterprise server. So it's not something you necessarily have to worry about. The Helm chart collectively takes care of that for you. In terms of interactivity and components, it's largely still the same as the on-premise installer. In terms of those services and components, we're still targeting apps with the scanner pods. We can still use things like the Burp Collaborator that you used to from either Pro or the on-prem deployment. So that's Kubernetes. Again, any questions on this, you can fire those into the team behind the scenes, and they'll be more than happy to answer any questions. So moving on to the demo, effectively, we're just going to walk you through kind of some best practice and some tips and tricks on getting set up, and particularly around scheduled scans, because that is really the sort of main use case for Burp Suite Enterprise. To begin with, not a particularly sexy element, as it were, but if we go to the networking page, this is an important component, especially if you're looking to integrate your installation with any sort of third-party apps or other elements within the environment. It's a good idea to get this section completed. So you've got our web server URL, which is effectively how we're accessing our installation. So by default, this will typically be localhost, and then you can change that after the fact once installation is complete. And then we append a web server port where the service is available over. And again, we can change that after the fact. But these need to be completed if we're going to integrate, i.e. talk to another system. And the format is as follows. So it's going to be your URL and then your port, and then separately your web server port as well. If you're more interested in a secure connection, so we can upload and enable TLS by uploading a certificate, and then just remember to change that web server to HTTPS at the same time. If, for whatever reason, you might require a proxy server to reach the public internet, we can do so here in the network settings page as well. But this is strictly for talking to portswigger.net, which is how we handle licensing and automatic updates. So if typically that connection will be restricted, you might want to add the details of a proxy server. But again, this is just for licensing and updates. If from a scanning perspective, you also require an upstream proxy, that's not configured here. That will be done so in your scan configuration. Additionally, again, if we're connecting to any other applications or we're using the GraphQL API from another system, then typically we're going to want to whitelist those URLs, which we can do so here for cause purposes. So once we've done that, we've got our web server set up. Typically, we're then going to set up our team. So as Adam mentioned, we don't limit you in terms of how many people can use Burp Suite Enterprise. It's very much a team-focused product. And we do have role-based access control, so feel free to throw as many users as you see fit. So you can carve out a specific role. So we have some built-in ones, but you have complete control to create a custom one as well. So if you go to add a new role, you can see here that you can get quite granular in terms of what permissions that role actually has. And then once you've created your necessary roles, you can assign those to groups, and then your users will fall into those groups. So if I go to new group, for example, I can select a predefined role or one that I've created. We can add those users, but also importantly, we can restrict sites. So if you know certain teams are only working with certain sites, this is one way to restrict that view that they have across your application portfolio. So that's the team. Next, we're probably going to want to check out our scanning machines. So you can deploy as many scanning machines as you wish. And these are going to be responsible for actually performing the scans against our target application. With a sort of single machine deployment where everything is deployed to the same, you'll see this local scanning machine, local IP address, but I can deploy as many as I want to external machines, external VMs, and that expands my capability because one, I'm bringing in more resource because as you know, scans can be quite intensive from a CPU and RAM perspective. So I want to distribute that as best I can. Generally speaking, from a sort of best practice perspective, we would do something around 5 or 6 max concurrent scans per scanning machine. You can take it above that, and we do see customers do so with quite a beefy VM, for example. But just from a best practices perspective, that's typically what we would recommend. And then once you've deployed all those scanning machines, we can see our license info here. So this is what you've purchased in terms of those max concurrent scans. Your total will be down here, and then you can distribute that amongst your scanning machines as you see fit. So for example, we might have 5 scanning machines, each with 5 concurrent scans, giving us our total of 25 if that's what we paid for. And we can further carve these out into scanning pools. So again, from a resource perspective, we can tie sites to pools. So we're effectively dedicating scanning machines to particular sites or sets of sites. So again, if it's very much a team focus, or we need to ensure that we've got that resource available for CI/CD scans and we're not impacting our regular scheduled scans, we can split those two out. So we set up our team, we've configured our networking, and our scanning machines are ready to go. Next job is to create our sites. And there's kind of 2 streams of thought here. So particularly for a new installation, or if you've got an awful lot of sites, you can use the import sites feature. So this lets you download a CSV template, which I've got here just to show you, and you can populate that sort of minimum in terms of required information in order to import all of those sites. So you can see here site name, included URLs that we want to include as part of our scans. If we want to exclude any, we can do so as well. If we want to assign it to a scanning pool, a particular scan configuration, and then email recipients for activity around that site. And then once we've completed that, we can import it here, and that's going to populate our site list. And then we can start to distribute everything into folders if we want to carve things out again into teams, geographical locations. And this is where bulk actions start to come into play. So we can start to select things like folders. That's going to select all of our sites within that folder. And we've got an update coming out shortly where we have folder level actions. So taking that notion of bulk activity further, say we've got a folder and we might want to assign the same scan configuration to all those sites, or with the folder level bulk actions, we can do so. I will just run you through creating a new site and what we would kind of consider best practice. So we're going to be configuring our own vulnerable website, and you are more than free to target this with your own scans. So this is a deliberately vulnerable website that we've created, and it's designed to be a modern web application effectively. So if I copy my URL, go back to my site, and we'll just call this vulnerable site. And because we're going to be looking specifically at scheduling, the idea for this site is that we're going to be running a daily scan against this particular web application. So we might call this daily, for example. We can distribute that into a folder. So we'll just call that one internal sites. And then we want to add our base URL, our site URL, which we'll add in here. And this is where the scan is going to start and run from, the initial crawl. We can do things like include URLs and exclude URLs if we wish to do so. So maybe we want to explicitly define a particular subdomain of our source URL. Maybe we don't want to scan the whole application. Typically, especially for initial testing, we'll just leave it at the one base URL. What is important is the protocols that we want to use. So by default, it's always going to land on both HTTP and S. If we only wanted to specify one, we would select scan using my specified protocols, and then ensure that we've supplied the correct protocol there as well. If, for example, we don't want to scan HTTP, but that's one provided, we're not going to get good results from that. So once done so, we can then move on to our scan settings. And in our most recent update, so that's version 2022.6 for Enterprise. You'll also need version 2022.6.1 for the scanner. We've introduced these new preset scan modes, which is going to be your default view when creating your site. And these give you access just to some very easy, quick options in terms of what type of scan I want to run. They're predefined, and as you can see from the descriptions there, they're fairly self-explanatory. So I can do a quick, lightweight scan, which is going to complete within 15 minutes. Good to fire off a quick scan and get some results and start analyzing fairly sharpish. We've got a fast scan, which is a bit more thorough, but it's still kind of biased more towards speed. Balance, which is very much middle of the road, which is going to be quite a popular one. And then a deeper scan. So if we want to have more coverage, deeper understanding of the application, but we're okay from a scan time perspective, that is something we might want to pick. Now you still have control over what that scan configuration looks like from a custom perspective, so you don't have to use the preset scan modes. They're just there to aid you, especially when you're initially testing your application. So we still have access to our full library. There's going to be the pre-built scan configurations that we have access to that you're probably familiar with, and then any custom scan configurations that we might want to include as well. For the purposes of this, we're doing a daily scheduled scan. So we're probably going to keep that at lightweight because we're just running it every single day. We just want to hit the main points in terms of the vulnerabilities within the application. And then maybe we would create another site and call that weekly. And we might run then a deep or balanced scan where we've got a bit more time, a larger scan window, for example. Maybe it's over the weekend. And instead of calling it daily, we just call it weekly or a weekend-based scan. We can also append our application logins, because if our site needs authentication, particularly if most of the content is locked behind an authenticated session, we're definitely going to want to add in some application login. By default, that's going to reflect just the username and password. So if the application itself is quite simple, single page username, password, we can just provide those credentials here and it'll be used for the scan itself. More typically, it's probably going to be a little bit more complicated in terms of that authentication process. So we're going to want to use our recorded login sequence. So in your browser, you can install the plugin, which is available within Chrome, and that allows us to record the session in an incognito window of us logging into the application. Again, we've got a great document around this, which offers some hints and tips to get the most in terms of an accurate recording, which we can link after the session. And then we can take the JSON that is generated from that, cut and paste that into here. And again, that'll be used as part of the scan. Every session will be authenticated with that script. Once we've completed all those details, we can click Save. That's now added our site. So we can now start to configure our schedule on top of that. Again, we're looking at a daily based schedule for this particular one. So if I go to New Scan, it's already pre-selected the site I'm configuring because I've just built it. And then I select Schedule and Repeat. And this is where I can design my schedule. So we're going to pick the date and time for which we want that to start. So just for example, we're going to go with 8 in the morning every day. And then when do we want to repeat that? So every one day forever, we can repeat a set number of times if we've got a particular window in terms of what we're interested in scan results wise, or until a particular date. We're looking to add a few more options down the line to how you can carve out that schedule, but this is fairly typical for most of our customers. And then very simply, we'll click Save. Oh, apologies, we'll pick that in the future. And now our schedule has been created and it's completely hands-off. So it's just going to run the scans every single day for us, 8 a.m. And we can check back in to start looking at results. But the main benefit of having this run every day is that we're going to start to build a picture over time of effectively the security posture of that given site. So if we were to jump back into scans, for example, here's all of my previously run scans. But I can also look at my schedule. So we can see here we've got multiple schedules for different applications within our particular environment. And then if I jump into my site list and I select a site, you can see here where the benefits of running a regular schedule for your sites starts to come into play, because we build this picture over time of the security posture. So what items have been resolved from a vulnerability perspective? Have any regressed? What is that change? And again, we can start to report on these issues across an extended period of time. So once we've done that, that's kind of the bread and butter of the scheduling. We might also want to be running pipeline-based scans. So very similar in nature, but typically these are going to be API driven. So we're going to give you the example of Jenkins, but our generic driver effectively works with any pipeline based software, depending on what your platform is. So in the case of Jenkins, we can add that specific driver in, and once done so, we'll actually be presented with a particular build step that is specific to Burp Suite Enterprise. So I'll take you through that configure one in a second, but if I come down here to build step, we can see here, we've now got Burp Site-Driven Scan and Burp Scan. So Site-Driven Scan is because we've pre-created a site, as we've seen in the UI, we've got our list of sites. This now has effectively a site ID. All of the information has been configured. So from a Jenkins perspective, it's very straightforward just to pick the Site-Driven Scan and include it as part of my pipeline. And it's going to take all the config information from the site level. Now, if I don't want to do that because perhaps I don't know where my application is going to be deployed to, maybe it's dynamic every time I run a pipeline, well, the Burp Scan is going to be a better choice in that scenario, because I can define what that URL is going to be as part of the pipeline. But to give an example of a site-driven scan, all I need to do is pass the URL. So again, we mentioned completing those network settings earlier. So now I can pull that URL and connect to my enterprise server. I've generated an API key. So again, going back to our users, our team, you can create an API user, which will generate that unique key. And I can cycle that key as I see fit. That's going to let me do an authenticated session in terms of an API call. And then I've got my site list. One of the benefits of the plugin is that that's going to pass that site list across. So I can select which site I want to scan as part of that pipeline. And then when do I want the build to fail? So perhaps I only want high and certain in terms of the severity and confidence level of the issues that are located during the scan, and then that'll fail my build based on what's been found. Maybe I've got a particular threshold where I can permit a certain number of issues. Well, I'll assign that. And as a developer, perhaps I'm not necessarily jumping in and out of the Burp Suite Enterprise UI, although as we mentioned, I can absolutely do so because we don't restrict those users, but I can still generate a report from my pipeline as well, which will be essentially the same report that I would see as a result of my scans in Burp Suite Enterprise in the UI. So now if I save that, anytime I build this particular project, that's going to initiate an API-driven scan back to Burp Suite Enterprise. And again, because of that driver, the two can communicate. We have that awareness of where the scan is up to, so Jenkins knows when to fail that build. Now, if we're not interested necessarily in pipeline scans, but we still want a bit of automation around Jenkins, we can still utilize that GraphQL API and essentially use a Jenkins job to schedule our scans, but via Jenkins. So we've got some GraphQL API documentation that we can provide again after the call, but all we need to do is take one of those examples, script it out with our kind of configuration information. So again, we can still do site-driven scans, take the site ID from a pre-populated one, include that inside of a Jenkins job. We might convert it to curl just to make life easier within Jenkins. But that's going to give us all the information we need for Jenkins to tell Burp Suite Enterprise, I want to run a scan at this particular date and time. One example of creating a scheduled item, which again, we could convert to curl, is here, and I'm happy to pass this example across. But the benefit of the GraphQL API is that we just got the one endpoint, but we can use mutations to effectively do anything we've seen within the UI. All of those elements are exposed. So we're creating a scheduled item, and our variables are down here at the bottom. So we call out that ID, and we define our schedule. And again, we authenticate this with the API key, and then we can talk to Burp Suite Enterprise that way. So if you're more interested in sort of automating and scripting outside of the UI, that's perfectly doable via the GraphQL API. You happy there, Adam? Have I missed anything? Or
I think that's pretty much everything covered. Thank you very much. We just wanted to, as we mentioned at the top of the agenda, give you a little bit of a sneak peek into what's coming up in terms of releases. So we're just going to go through a couple of UI changes that are due in 2022.7. So in terms of changes that are happening within the UI, one thing that's been fed back from some of the customer interactions that we've had, kind of twofold. One is in terms of scan progress checks. So where they're using the tool, we want to see what's happening within the scan. If a user is familiar with Birch Beat Professional, potentially they were there looking at the scan and how it worked, but that wasn't available within the Enterprise UI, and also connection checks. So if you want to whiz through those, Alex.
Yeah, so a lot of the feedback, we've kind of talked around scheduling and looking at results and building that long-term picture. But quite often we want to see the progress of scans as well. We don't necessarily want to be hands-off all the time, especially when we're troubleshooting. So we've got this concept of the timeline coming into the UI. So rather than just kind of watching the sort of bar go around, not kind of knowing where the scan's up to, now we've split into distinct steps. So we kind of know where the scan is up to at all times, but it's also going to report things to us. So you can see here the scan's queued because it's assigning it to an available scanning machine. Then it's going to start when that's done. So we know the scan's kicked off. Then we know we're in the crawling phase. We can look at things like requests made, how many locations are we discovering, what URL is it up to right now. Then the audit phase, this is where we start to see issues starting to be presented. And we could also potentially start to look at any error messages that we might receive if we have to skip particular checks for whatever reason. And then when the scan actually finishes, we can start to drill down into those results in more detail. Another one comes back to that site creation. So the kind of idea of being able to perform a connection health check, i.e. can my scanning machine reach what it is I'm trying to scan in terms of the target site. So you're going to be able to run this connection check at the point you've either created your site, do a check, or any time in the future just to make sure that that connection is still valid. And it's going to give you that connection status and response back as well. And then if for whatever reason it's not returned, you've got that particular response and you can start to troubleshoot. So for example, perhaps the scanning machine needs a proxy configuration applied in terms of the scan configuration.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Worth mentioning that our roadmap is publicly available on the site. We're looking at publishing a refresh of that in the next couple of weeks. So please do visit portswigger.net to take a look at that. In terms of recommended next steps, in fairness, it's fairly simple. You don't mind skipping on, Alex? For those users that potentially don't update, we'd love to get you on to 2022.6 and obviously 2022.7 when it's released at the end of July. I won't give a specific date because I know our engineers will slap my wrist for that. But essentially, a lot of the features and functionality that Alex has shown you during the overview today are only available on the latest releases. So especially with regards to the preset scan configs, it's definitely worth getting up to date. And also, if the scanner's not up to date, then it's also not discovering the latest vulnerabilities. Also, if you want to have a play around with those preset scan configs and don't have a website to test, as Alex mentioned, we've got the Deliberately Vulnerable website, which is shown on the screen now. So the gin and juice shop that we've developed over time, it's something that you can run and we'll happily test against. You wouldn't mind popping on? So one thing that we just wanted to grab whilst we've still got the audience here, if you wouldn't mind, I'm just going to launch a quick poll that should be live on your screens now. Just 4 questions, should take you no more than sort of 60 seconds to complete. Just in terms of your usage of Birch Beat Enterprise Edition and whether that's going to change over time. We're really interested to get your feedback on that. Also, it looks like the Q&A box has been fairly quiet during the session, so please use this opportunity now to answer any questions or ask any questions that are there. We've got the team live, ready and raring to go. And we'd be happy to follow up over email should anything else crop up post the session. As we mentioned, we'll also recorded the sessions. We'll send the recording out either via a YouTube link or via an embedded link in the email after the session. And please feel free to forward on to any of your colleagues. I can see quite a few of you are participating at the moment, which is great. I'll give you another sort of 60 seconds or so to complete through that. As I mentioned, the Q&A facility is still live. So see a couple of questions in there. My colleague James is replying to those now.
So I can see Matt there regarding AD. So absolutely, So what we looked at was locally managed users within Burp itself, but we have both integrations with SAML and LDAP. So if we just jump very quickly back into the UI, we come to integrations here, you can configure both SAML and LDAP, and even if you've got a skim module along the lines of SAML, we can extend that as well. So you can import effectively your existing user group structure. You would create the same groups in terms of the naming convention within Burp, and then those users would inherit the permissions that you would assign to those particular groups, but they would absolutely be able to log in with their AD or SSO credentials. Correct.
Great stuff. We've got 5 of you that participated in the poll. If anyone else is able to participate and complete that, that'd be fantastic. It'd be really helpful for us. We've got a couple of questions that are live now. I think James is sending answers across. You want to go through any of those, or should we answer those?
So Joseph mentions around resources. Okay, so I mean, with the standard VM-based deployment, the enterprise and web server will sit on their own VM, and that's fairly static. We've got a document that details what that configuration should be. And then each external scanning machine, so it sits on its own machine, will also have a recommended CPU and memory allocation, depending on how many concurrent scans you wish to run. From a scale perspective, typically you wouldn't increase the singular scanning machine every time you want to add a scan. Typically, once you get to a certain point, as I mentioned, that's usually between sort of 5-10 max concurrent scans. You would then deploy another scanning machine, which would increase that scale and be resourced accordingly. Again, the documentation we've got that applies to the scanning machine, so we can send that across.
Fantastic. I think we'll leave it there, folks. Thank you very much for joining us today. Any feedback on the session would be appreciated. As I say, we'll follow up over email. We'd love to hear from you and your experiences with Burp Suite Enterprise Edition. Any questions that haven't been answered, then we will follow up after the session. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks all.